And then, on her 8th interruption, the courtroom froze. Jaws dropped, and history was made. The heavy wooden benches creaked as spectators leaned forward, almost in unison, straining to catch every syllable. The vaulted ceilings of the chamber seemed to press down with the weight of centuries, but at that instant, all of that history narrowed to a single exchange between two women. One, fierce and insistent, cutting in with the sharp edge of defiance. The other, calm yet unshakable, carrying the gravity of the robe she wore and the dignity of the seat she held. For 7 times before this, Justice Brown Jackson had been forced to hold her ground as the interruptions came, each sharper than the last, each testing the patience of everyone present. There had been murmurs in the gallery, the kind that ripple like tiny earthquakes through a room. Some exchanged glances of disbelief, others rolled their eyes, still others smirked, sensing spectacle. But the justice herself never flinched. She absorbed the tension, let it build, and waited. It was on that 8th moment, when Crockett lunged in again, confident, insistent, almost daring the justice to falter, that something shifted. The sound of her voice collided with the silence, and then, in the brief pause that followed, the chamber seemed to suspend in air. No coughs, no whispers, no shuffling of papers. Just silence. And into that silence, Justice Jackson delivered a response so measured, so deliberate, that the very walls seemed to lean in. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't a scolding. It was the kind of answer that slices deeper than anger ever could, exposing not only the weakness of the interruption, but the strength of the principle standing against it. The courtroom gasped, not out of politeness, not out of habit, but out of the recognition that they had just witnessed something rare, dignity asserting itself against arrogance in real time. Phones in pockets buzzed as notes were taken for live tweets. Reporters gripped their pens harder. Even her critics, seated stiffly, had no choice but to acknowledge the gravity of what had unfolded, but to understand why this 8th moment mattered so much. We need to go back. The session was never meant to be ordinary. On paper, it was a standard hearing. Technical, procedural, the kind that usually passes with little more than a headline or two in the morning papers. But beneath the sterile legalese, the stakes pulsed with electricity. This wasn't just about interpretation of law. It was about who defines justice in America, whose voice carries authority, and whether dignity could withstand the theater of political ambition. At the center of the storm stood Representative Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had made her reputation with sharp retorts and an unmistakable fire. She was no stranger to confrontation. In fact, confrontation was her currency. In debate halls, on cable news, and across viral social clips, she had become known for her quick wit, her unapologetic jabs, and her refusal to yield even an inch. Supporters adored her defiance, hailing her as fearless. Critics accused her of mistaking volume for wisdom. Either way, she commanded attention, and she knew it. That confidence carried into the courtroom like a flare shot into the night sky. Crockett wasn't there to play small. Every sentence she delivered landed with the cadence of someone auditioning for history, not just arguing a point of law. Each word was polished for effect, sharpened for maximum impact. And yet, as the minutes ticked by, it became clear. Her urgency was colliding with someone who embodied an entirely different kind of strength. Across from her sat Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first black woman on the Supreme Court, a figure whose very presence testified to resilience, persistence, and the long road of struggle. Unlike Crockett's fast-talking, rapid-fire style, Jackson's authority was quiet, deliberate. She didn't need to raise her voice to be heard. Her words, chosen with surgical precision, carried the weight of a lifetime of discipline and a seat earned through battles most could never imagine. Where Crockett thrived on interruption, Jackson thrived on patience. Where Crockett sought to dominate the tempo, Jackson altered it simply by holding her ground. The clash between them wasn't accidental. It was elemental. It was the collision of two approaches to power, the roar versus the steady pulse, spectacle versus substance, arrogance versus dignity, and the nation was watching. Live streams carried the proceedings beyond the courtroom, spilling onto social media where clips were clipped, reactions poured in, and hashtags began forming before the session had even concluded. For millions watching at home, immigrants, workers, young students of color who saw themselves reflected in the faces at that bench, this was more than politics. It was identity, validation, and proof that their dignity could survive the storm of interruptions. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing that the day's story was writing itself in real time. This wasn't going to be filed under routine coverage. It would be remembered as a showdown, because what unfolded wasn't simply about who could out-talk the other. It was about whether dignity could withstand disruption, whether truth could outlast arrogance, whether composure could silence chaos without raising its voice. No one in that room could predict how far this clash was about to go. Jasmine Crockett did not enter politics quietly. From her earliest days on the local stage, she made it clear she wasn't there to fit into the old order. Her speeches dripped with fire. Her interviews burned with sound bites that could ricochet across cable networks in seconds. She was the kind of politician who didn't wait for the spotlight to find her. She dragged it toward herself, fueled by defiance and the certainty that volume was its own form of power. Her rise was rapid, marked by a string of confrontations that left audiences divided but never indifferent. In one televised debate, when an opponent tried to lecture her on policy, she cut him off with a smile sharpened into a dagger. "You've had your turn talking down to people like me for decades. That era is over." The clip spread like wildfire, shared by supporters as proof of her fearlessness. They called her the voice of the new generation, unyielding, unafraid, unwilling to sit politely while others talked over her. In committee hearings, too, her style became a trademark. Where most would defer to procedural order, Crockett thrived on breaking the rhythm. She interrupted, redirected, demanded attention. Every exchange became theater, every microphone her stage. To her admirers, it was exhilarating. A sign that finally someone had the courage to smash through decorum and call out hypocrisy in real time. To her critics, it was exhausting, the very embodiment of arrogance wrapped in the language of empowerment. But Crockett didn't care about the critics. She measured success not in their approval, but in the roar of her base, in the viral moments clipped for TikTok. In the standing ovations at rallies where people cheered her every interruption as a victory over the establishment. In a political landscape where attention was currency, she was rich. And yet beneath the bravado, there lingered a flaw, one that her allies rarely acknowledged, but her detractors never missed. Her reliance on confrontation, the way she lunged forward instead of stepping back, often left her exposed. For every thunderous applause line, there were murmurs about whether she truly mastered the substance beneath the spectacle. For every viral clip, there was another critic who wondered aloud if her fire masked a lack of depth. Still, Crockett leaned harder into the persona. She wore the criticisms like badges, insisting they only proved she was shaking up a broken system. When accused of arrogance, she doubled down. "If telling the truth out loud makes me arrogant, then I'll wear it every day." The line earned her cheers from the faithful, but it also revealed the sharp edge she carried into every room, the edge that cut through opponents, yes, but also threatened to cut into her own credibility, and that edge was on full display the day she stepped into the courtroom across from Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson. Crockett brought with her the same cocky energy that had electrified town halls and cable panels. She carried herself like someone who had already won the crowd before the first word was spoken, someone who believed interruption was a tool of dominance rather than a breach of respect. Her gestures were bold, her tone biting, her presence undeniable. But against Brown Jackson, that energy began to look different. For every interruption Crockett launched, Jackson responded with composure. For every attempt to rattle the flow, Jackson anchored the room with a steady calm. The very thing that had made Crockett a star, the unrelenting sharpness of her tongue, suddenly seemed reckless. Against the measured gravity of a justice whose authority was not claimed but earned through decades of discipline. The contrast was striking. Crockett's fire against Jackson's quiet storm, one seeking to dominate, the other simply holding steady. And in that contrast, the seeds of what was to come began to take root, because the very edge that fueled Crockett's rise would soon spark her greatest humiliation. Ketanji Brown Jackson's journey to the nation's highest court was not the story of shortcuts or viral moments. It was the story of discipline, the kind that begins long before cameras are watching, forged in quiet study sessions, late nights, and the unshakable belief that her voice deserved to be heard in rooms that were never built with her in mind. Born in Washington, D.C., and raised in Miami, she grew up surrounded by the weight of expectation and the reality of barriers. Her parents, both public school teachers, instilled in her not only a love of learning but a respect for service. Her father studied law books at the kitchen table while she did her homework beside him, a scene that would foreshadow her own calling. She knew what it meant to be overlooked, underestimated, even dismissed. But she also knew the power of preparation, the armor of intellect. At Harvard, she excelled against odds that would have crushed many. She graduated magna cum laude, earned her law degree, and went on to clerk for Justice Stephen Breyer. At every step, she carried the invisible burden of being the first or the only, the quiet but heavy weight of representation. In boardrooms, courtrooms, and hearings, she faced the doubters who looked past her brilliance and saw only their assumptions. But she never raised her voice to meet their skepticism. She let her work speak, and it spoke loudly. Her career spanned public defense, private practice, and the federal bench. She earned a reputation as a jurist who listened deeply, who respected the humanity of those who stood before her, even the accused and marginalized. While others chased headlines, she cultivated mastery. While others thrived on spectacle, she refined the art of composure. When President Biden nominated her to the Supreme Court, the nation witnessed the culmination of decades of perseverance. And when the Senate confirmed her, she became the first black woman to sit on that bench, a milestone as profound as it was overdue. But history-making does not erase the daily tests. From the moment she took her seat, she carried not only her own name, but the aspirations of millions who saw themselves reflected in her achievement. For every careful ruling, there were critics ready to pounce. For every measured word, there were voices eager to twist it. She understood this. She accepted it. Because for Jackson, the goal was never applause. It was service, dignity, and justice. Her style on the court reflected that philosophy. She was deliberate, never rushed, her tone precise but never condescending. She could dismantle an argument with a single sentence, not through aggression but through clarity. Her presence commanded respect, not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. Those who entered her courtroom quickly realized you could not shake her. You could not rattle her composure, and you could not outlast her patience. It is this very patience that made her a foil to figures like Jasmine Crockett. Where Crockett built a reputation on volume and interruption, Jackson built hers on restraint and endurance. Where Crockett thrived on throwing her opponents off balance, Jackson thrived on never losing hers. The contrast could not have been sharper. One chasing validation in real time. The other content to let time itself validate her legacy. Yet behind Jackson's composure lies a truth often missed by those who see only her calm exterior. That discipline was not born of privilege. It was born of necessity. To be a black woman in the upper echelons of law meant she could never afford to stumble where others might be forgiven. It meant knowing that every interruption endured, every slight absorbed, every glance dismissed could not be met with the anger she might have felt, but with the grace that the world demanded of her. To survive, to thrive, to ascend, she had to be sharper, steadier, stronger. This is why her presence carried such resonance. When she sat at that bench, she carried not only her own victories, but the echoes of every door slammed in the face of women before her. When she spoke, her words were not only her own, but a chorus of ancestors and communities who had waited too long to be heard. Her intellect was undeniable, but her humanity, her capacity to remain centered in a world determined to push her off balance, was what made her singular. And so, when the day arrived that she faced Jasmine Crockett's barrage of interruptions, the weight of her journey was not invisible. It sat in the room with her, a silent reminder of everything she had overcome. Every interruption was not just Crockett testing her patience, it was history testing her resolve. the same resolve that had carried her through every gate that once seemed locked. For 7 interruptions, she held steady, unshaken. But the eighth would force her hand, revealing not only the depth of her composure, but the sharpness of her conviction. And yet, even she would be tested by what came next. The hearing began with the usual rhythm. Questions posed, answers delivered, the formal choreography of law. But that rhythm did not last long. Within minutes, Representative Jasmine Crockett made her presence felt, cutting in before Justice Jackson had even completed her first thought. The first interruption came swiftly, like a jab meant to establish dominance. Crockett leaned forward, her voice rising over Jackson's mid-sentence explanation. The justice stopped, composed herself, and patiently waited for the outburst to pass. She didn't protest, didn't scold. She simply resumed her answer with the same calm cadence, as if daring Crockett's noise to compete with her clarity. The second interruption arrived with sharper edges. Crockett dismissed Jackson's framing, injecting her own spin before the justice could finish her argument. This time the gallery shifted uneasily. A few eyebrows rose, a murmur passed among the press row. Still, Jackson remained unmoved, her tone steady, her gaze direct. She was not going to fight volume with volume. By the third interruption, the tension in the chamber began to mount. Crockett's impatience was now unmistakable, her insistence bordering on combative. She gestured, raised her hand, layered her voice over Jackson's in a clash of sound. And once again, Jackson chose patience, pausing mid-thought, letting the silence re-establish her authority before continuing. The restraint was powerful, even disarming. The fourth and fifth interruptions came in quick succession. Crockett was no longer simply interjecting. She was attempting to steer the conversation, to take command of the floor itself. Members of the audience shifted uncomfortably. The spectacle was no longer energizing but unsettling. Jackson's refusal to bite back only heightened the sense of imbalance, arrogance hammering against a wall of composure. By the sixth interruption, the atmosphere had changed entirely. The earlier murmurs had hardened into audible sighs. Reporters exchanged glances, their pens scribbling furiously. Spectators looked to the bench, wondering how long this contest of wills could continue. And yet, there sat Justice Jackson, her posture unshaken, her patience intact. Every pause, every measured restart of her remarks sent an unspoken message. You cannot shake me. The seventh interruption landed heavier than the rest. Crockett's voice rose sharply, her tone tinged with frustration, as though sheer force could break through Jackson's calm. The room seemed to tilt under the weight of it. The clash no longer subtle but undeniable. Some in the gallery frowned. Others shook their heads. Even allies of Crockett began to look uneasy, sensing that the balance of sympathy was shifting. Through it all, Justice Jackson remained the picture of discipline. She did not raise her voice, did not betray even a flicker of irritation. Instead, she carried herself like a steady tide against the crashing waves, unmoved, waiting for the storm to tire itself out. Every interruption only magnified the dignity with which she absorbed it. Every attempt to rattle her only underscored the futility of the effort. By the time the seventh interruption subsided, the chamber was taut with expectation. It was clear that something had to give. Crockett had pushed again and again, believing dominance could be seized by sheer force of interruption. Jackson had absorbed each blow with poise, refusing to be drawn into the spectacle. The air felt heavy, as though everyone knew they were standing on the edge of a turning point. But on the eighth, everything changed. The eighth interruption came like the others, sharp, insistent, cutting across Justice Jackson's measured cadence. But this time, instead of yielding the floor with her familiar patience, she held her ground. Her voice did not falter, did not shrink beneath the noise. Instead, it rose, calm, firm, deliberate, slicing through the chamber with a resonance that left no room for doubt. "Representative Crockett," she said, her tone carrying both authority and restraint, "you have spoken. Now allow me to finish." The words landed not as a rebuke, but as a command cloaked in dignity. For the first time that day, Crockett's rhythm broke. She froze mid-gesture, her hand hovering in the air, her eyes blinking as though recalibrating. The silence that followed was unlike any that had come before. It was not the pause between interruptions. It was a silence thick with recognition, the room understanding almost in unison that the balance of power had shifted. Jackson leaned forward slightly, her expression unshaken. She did not need theatrics. Her presence was the theater. "We are not here," she continued, her words crisp and deliberate, "to measure who can speak the loudest. We are here to measure the strength of the law. And the law is not strengthened by interruption. It is strengthened by reason." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Some clutched their pens tighter. Others looked at one another in disbelief. Even the court clerks, trained to remain stone-faced, exchanged the briefest of glances. It was not just what she said, but how she said it. Every syllable carried the weight of history, the battles she had fought, the milestones she embodied, the patience she had guarded until this very moment. Crockett opened her mouth, perhaps to retort, but no sound came. The courtroom had shifted against her. The interruptions that once seemed bold now hung in the air like evidence against her own credibility. Her confidence cracked under the quiet precision of Jackson's words. Justice Jackson did not stop there. She pressed forward, weaving logic and moral authority into a statement that would reverberate beyond the walls of that chamber. "Every person who enters this courtroom deserves respect," she said. "Not because of who they are, not because of the office they hold, but because justice itself demands it. And when respect is denied, justice is weakened. I will not allow that, not here, not today, not ever." The sentence hung in the air like a verdict. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then came the audible reaction, a collective gasp, a murmur swelling into something closer to awe. Journalists scrambled to capture the line word for word. A few spectators nodded vigorously, as though they had just witnessed more than a legal exchange. They had witnessed a moral stand. Crockett's composure faltered visibly. Her shoulders stiffened, her jaw clenched, her gaze wavered. For the first time, the sharp-tongued representative seemed unsure, caught in the harsh spotlight of a truth that could not be deflected with wit or volume. Against Jackson's steady fire, her interruptions suddenly seemed small, even petulant. Jackson, however, did not gloat. She did not press the advantage with sarcasm or scorn. She simply allowed the weight of her words to settle, then resumed her original thought as though the disruption had never occurred. It was the ultimate triumph, not anger, not spectacle, but truth delivered with dignity, and that was what made it unforgettable. The hero did not conquer by shouting louder. She conquered by showing that she never needed to shout at all. Even those predisposed to oppose her could not deny the impact. Some scribbled hastily in their notebooks, trying to spin the moment as overreach, but their faces betrayed them. They had felt it too. The authority of a woman who had endured, who had fought too long to be dismissed, who carried herself with the kind of composure that could silence arrogance in its tracks. The chamber buzzed as the reality set in. They had just witnessed a moment destined to be replayed across the country. A moment that distilled the contrast between arrogance and dignity, between noise and truth, between spectacle and service. Crockett shifted in her seat, her once certain swagger diminished. Jackson did not need to look at her directly. The silence between them spoke volumes. This was not a personal victory, it was a demonstration of principle. And that made it all the more devastating. As the justice continued her statement, the audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. Her logic flowed effortlessly, each argument supported by precedent, each principle grounded in law. But beyond the legal brilliance was something deeper, moral clarity. She spoke not just to the attorneys and representatives before her, but to the millions outside those walls who had ever felt dismissed, silenced, or talked over. She embodied their vindication. The room, once restless with interruptions, now held its breath. Every ear was tuned to her voice. Every heart measured its rhythm against her steady cadence. It was not a contest anymore. It was a lesson, and when she finished, there was no interruption, no attempt to wrestle back the floor. Even Crockett, her sharpness blunted, sat still, her expression betraying both frustration and disbelief. She had not been shouted down. She had been outclassed. What lingered in that courtroom was not anger but awe. Justice Jackson had turned the eighth interruption into a defining moment, not just for the hearing, not just for her career, but for anyone who had ever doubted the strength of dignity. But the real shock came after the courtroom fell silent. The silence inside the courtroom did not last long. The moment Justice Jackson's words landed, the outside world was already stirring. Within minutes, phones lit up across the country, social media feeds clogged with clips and quotes. The eighth interruption replayed over and over like a cinematic climax. The hashtags arrived first. Eighth interruption. Justice prevails. Respect in the court. Each one pulsed across platforms, climbing into trending lists within the hour. Short videos captured the stunned faces of those in the gallery, looping endlessly on TikTok and Twitter. The gasp of the courtroom became a meme in itself. Split screens pairing Crockett's faltering expression with Jackson's calm declaration. Supporters of the justice flooded timelines with captions like, "This is what dignity looks like," and she shut it down without raising her voice. Commentators wasted no time weighing in. Legal analysts on cable networks framed the exchange as more than just a procedural scuffle. One described it as a masterclass in judicial composure, another as the day arrogance met its limit. Even those who had previously criticized Jackson for being too measured admitted that her restraint had become her greatest weapon. She didn't need to outshout anyone, one analyst said. She simply reminded us that truth doesn't need a megaphone, it needs patience. Politicians chimed in as well, their statements filtered through the lenses of loyalty and ideology. Allies of Crockett attempted to spin the confrontation as passion misunderstood, but the footage spoke louder than their words. Across the aisle, Jackson's defenders seized the moment as proof of her strength. "What we saw today," one senator declared, "was dignity holding its ground against chaos." But beyond the punditry and political statements, it was the ordinary Americans who carried the story forward. On Facebook pages, community forums, and Instagram posts, people who had felt silenced in their own lives spoke of recognition. Teachers described moments when they had been interrupted by louder voices in meetings. Immigrant parents recalled being dismissed in institutions that never valued their accents. Young women in law schools posted that they saw in Jackson a mirror of the strength they aspired to. For many, it wasn't just about a courtroom clash. It was about seeing composure validated, seeing patience rewarded, seeing someone refuse to be diminished in the face of arrogance. It was the kind of validation that millions didn't realize they were waiting for until they watched the clip unfold. Memes carried the message to younger audiences, packaging the moment with humor but never dulling its power. 7 times she stayed silent, one viral tweet read. But the 8th? She dropped the Constitution like a mixtape. Another simply paired Jackson's quote, "We are not here to measure who can speak the loudest," with a photo of Crockett, her mouth frozen mid-interruption. The punchline needed no explanation, and then came the op-eds. Editorial boards called it a turning point in the culture of public discourse. Some praised it as a reminder that respect is not weakness. Others celebrated it as the triumph of substance over spectacle. A few skeptics grumbled about political theater, but even their words betrayed acknowledgement that Jackson had won the stage without ever chasing it. The ripple spread outward, finding its way into classrooms, workplaces, and dinner table conversations. Clips were shown in civics courses. Pastors referenced the moment in Sunday sermons. Talk radio hosts debated it, and late-night comedians replayed it with a mixture of reverence and wit. What gave the exchange its staying power was not just the gasp of the courtroom, but the way people across the nation saw themselves in it. Everyone had known a Crockett, loud, insistent, unwilling to yield. Everyone had longed to be a Jackson, calm, steady, dignified in the face of arrogance. The 8th interruption became shorthand for that universal struggle, a cultural parable wrapped in a single exchange. For Jackson, the victory was not about applause. It was about principle. But for those watching, it became something larger. Proof that in a society often dominated by noise, there was still power in composure, and this ripple effect would carry a message larger than either figure in that room. In the days that followed, The debate over the eighth interruption faded into something larger, something more profound. The clip had gone viral, yes, but its endurance wasn't just about the spectacle of one woman silencing another. It was about what that silence, followed by carefully measured truth, revealed about power, dignity, and the way we choose to face arrogance. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson did not win the moment by force. She did not win by raising her voice, by matching insult with insult, or by wrestling attention to the ground. She won by remembering who she was, by embodying the very principle she has carried throughout her career, that patience, clarity, and discipline outlast the noise of ego. This is the lesson that echoed beyond the marble walls of the court. In a democracy that often feels overwhelmed by shouting, by viral rants and 20-second sound bites, Jackson reminded us that true authority doesn't need to scream. It doesn't need to cut in. It doesn't need to demand the floor. It holds the floor by the weight of its integrity. Her composure, tested 7 times and broken open on the 8th, became a kind of mirror for America. It reflected the struggles of immigrants who have had to stay calm as their names were mispronounced, their accents mocked, their intelligence doubted. It reflected the reality of women who have been talked over in boardrooms and classrooms, only to rise by letting their work, not their volume, speak. It reflected every person who has ever felt smaller in the face of arrogance, yet refused to surrender their dignity. And it gave us permission to believe in a different kind of strength. Not the strength of the loudest voice, not the swagger of unchecked ego, but the strength of composure. Jackson showed that you can hold your ground without losing yourself, that you can defend your truth without lowering it into the mud of insult. That is not weakness. That is not passivity. That is resilience. That is power. In this light, the clash was never really about Crockett versus Jackson. It was about 2 ways of living in the world. One defined by interruption, impatience, and the illusion that dominance comes from noise. The other, defined by quiet certainty, discipline, and the belief that justice is bigger than one moment of spectacle. Which side of that struggle we choose, individually and collectively, will shape the future of our democracy. Will we be a society that rewards interruption, or one that values dignity? Will we celebrate arrogance or patience? Will we honor the loudest voices or the truest ones? Justice Jackson's 8th point was more than a counter in a courtroom. It was a reminder of who we can be. That we do not have to let arrogance define us. That we do not have to yield our ground to those who mistake noise for authority. That dignity, when held with discipline, can be louder than any shout. Her example is not just hers to keep. It belongs to all of us. To every student fighting to be heard in a classroom. To every worker silenced by a domineering boss. To every citizen tired of watching democracy drown in division and disrespect. Her composure is a roadmap. Stay calm, stay rooted, stay true, and let the truth itself do the work. And so when the court gasped that day, it was not only at the spectacle of one interruption too many. It was at the recognition of something timeless, that arrogance will always burn itself out, but dignity endures. But for us, watching from afar, the lesson is clear. 8 interruptions, 7 absorbed with silence, the 8th answered with truth. That was the moment that turned a courtroom into a stage, a clash into a lesson, and a headline into history. The title of this story is not exaggeration. The 8th interruption really did change everything, because moments like this remind us that history is not always shaped by the loudest voices. Sometimes it's defined by the calmest ones, by those who choose restraint over rage, clarity over chaos, and dignity over arrogance. Justice Jackson didn't just answer Crockett. She answered a culture that too often rewards interruption, disrespect, and ego. And in doing so, she showed us a different kind of power. That's why people gasped. That's why the clip went viral. And that's why we're still talking about it now, because deep down, we know this wasn't just about 2 figures in a courtroom. It was about us. About who we want to be as a country, as communities, as individuals. And here's the truth. The fight between arrogance and dignity doesn't end in that chamber. It lives in our classrooms, in our workplaces, in our politics, in our daily lives. Every time someone tries to silence you, Every time noise tries to drown out truth, you're standing in that same moment. You have the same choice. Lower yourself to the noise or rise above it with dignity. So if you believe composure is stronger than interruption, if you believe patience is louder than arrogance, if you believe truth will always outlast noise, then share this story. Subscribe, add your voice, and be part of the movement. Because the world needs more people willing to choose dignity on the 8th interruption.